This tutorial is for how to make a 1-pelt Coyote lap blanket. This guy. Using a regular sewing machine, not a fur sewing machine. So it's a really great option for people that have a regular sewing machine but not a fur sewing machine. And it lets you take one Coyote pelt that starts out at about 10 inches wide and turn it into a 30-inch wide blanket or thereabouts. This technique is not meant to replace making a regular fur blanket, it's just another option. And it creates a really nice, lightweight, flowy blanket that's lighter weight than it would be if it was a full, like sewn skin to skin regular fur blanket. It's also a great option if you don't have a lot of pelts but you want to make something kind of big. This tutorial is only the second time I've made this type of blanket, so you're kind of along for the ride for some troubleshooting and thinking through the process. After making one, I did make some improvements on the second one, which is in this video, but there's definitely still room for improvement, so don't feel like you have to stick to exactly the way that I'm doing it. You can change it up a little bit and make it your own. And this one is really more of a guidelines or formula. There's no pattern involved. So welcome to the creative process and hopefully you learned something. Let's get started. I have a Coyote pelt here that I'm going to use for the blanket. It has already been blocked. The pelt's tanned at the tannery and then you get it back, spray down the hide, wet it, stretch it out, staple it out. It dries nice and flat, gets all the wrinkles out, makes it nice and firm so it's easy to cut out the pattern pieces. So this pelt has already been blocked. If you want to see an example of blocking, you can check out the other full video tutorials that I have available on YouTube right now. The full fur bomber hat video goes through how to block a Coyote pelt. So refer to those for details on blocking. This video will focus on making the blanket. So the first thing I need to do is mark the center line, and then from there I'm going to mark out 1 centimeter spaces. To mark the center line, I'm looking at the bottom here. You can see where the hair color changes, where the tail was. So I'm going to put a mark right about in the center of that. And then on the top, you can also see where there's a color change here, right along there, where it's more gray and then kind of goes to like yellow tips and then gray again. I'm gonna mark in the center of that. And in general on this pelt, you can kind of see a color change on the hide when you get towards the center because the thickness of the hide is a little bit different. And you can even kind of see like the hair growth patterns into the center. This was over fleshed a little bit. It's not always that obvious to see where the roots of the hair come through the hide like that. And they're not really coming through, they're just visible because the hide is a little bit thinner than it needs to be. But that's okay for this project that we're doing. So I connect those lines and then we have a center mark. And to double check it, I'm just going to put a finger on the center mark, flip it up, and see how close it feels to being in the middle of the pelt. Yep, I think that's good enough. It doesn't have to be perfect, just pretty close. This pelt has already been brushed, so I don't need to brush it right now. This is not it's not a perfect pelt. It's not the absolute best pelt for a project like this because it's a little bit rubbed down on the flanks and the rump area here. Like compared to up here, we still have a lot of nice guard hairs. It's a little bit rubbed, but I think it's still gonna make a beautiful blanket, and it's also a good example piece. Back to the hide side. We're going to be working in centimeters, so I have a centimeter ruler, and these are just guidelines, kind of a rough formula, so you can make your own blanket. You don't have to follow this exactly how I do it, but I'm going to make centimeter wide strips out of this pelt. So I'm using a centimeter ruler. If you wanted to make your strips wider, or you don't have a centimeter ruler, you could do 1/2 inch strips. I'm going to go top and bottom and mark every centimeter, starting from the center. For this, use either a fine tip marker or a pen. If you use a Sharpie, the lines might end up being too thick and just taking up too much space when we're only working with centimeter wide spaces. Okay, so that's marked. I'm gonna mark the bottom. Okay, so that looks good. Take a look at your marks and make sure they're even and all 1 centimeter apart. You can see I made a mistake here and marked, I had done a 1.5 centimeters, so I had to cross that one out and then go back and resume marking correctly. So now I'm gonna go back and kind of starting in the middle, going out, connect my lines. And as I'm drawing my lines, I'm gonna make sure and go slow so that I'm matching up lines correctly and not either skipping one and going to the next one, or keeping one behind so that my lines get crazy. So once you've got half done, go back, look at your lines, see if any of them need to be fixed. Missing a little here, this got a little skinny, that got a little wide, missing a little bit there. And if you draw another line, if you change it, either use a different colored pen so you don't get confused, or cross out your original line. And then continue making your lines on the other side. Okay, getting a little too far into this armpit area and not being able to draw straight lines anymore. So I'm going to count out and see how many lines we have total, figure out how many strips I want, and if I need to draw any more lines, and fudge this area a little bit. Okay, this is my original center line. 15, 14. So I have 15 on this side, 14 on this side. So I would like one more to have 30. I'm just gonna double check that. I'm gonna get one more line on this side, and then I'm gonna cut them out and deal with this crinkliness later. And I drew that line wrong. So I'm going to get a different colored pen. Okay, so I know on this I need to follow the blue line, not the black line. Before I get these cut out, I'm going to number them all across the top and the bottom so that I can keep track of which is which. So this one's going to be number 1. I have all of my vertical lines drawn on the pelt now. So I need to flip it over and decide where I want to draw horizontal lines to cut off, just square off the top and the bottom. So along the top here, it looks like I can go as close to the edge as I want because all that fur looks really nice. On the bottom, I think I'm going to cut it off about here where I can see this change from where it goes kind of dark guard hairs and then just turns into like fluff there right on the edge. So to figure out where that transition is, I'm going to stick my finger there and hold it and flip it over. And mark it. I'll mark it on this side too. Okay, so this is the bottom. I'm gonna go with this line here and draw my line, and then it looks like I'm gonna need to move some of my numbers up higher so they don't get cut off. I'm just gonna rotate it so it's an easier side for me to draw against my ruler. So I want to try and get it as square as possible, but when you're trying to draw lines on something that is squishy like this, they tend to get just a little bit off. So if I look at this line on my ruler here from 7 to 11, and I match it up with this line here and make sure it's lined up, actually pretty straight through here. Get a little off, and over here we're a little bit more off kilter. So I'm just gonna rotate slightly until when I eyeball it, it looks pretty good. We're definitely going for pretty good, not perfect. Okay. Cut off some of my numbers, so I'm gonna redraw those. Okay, and I'll draw my line on the top. I want to get this as close to those staple marks as I can. And again, I want it to be as square as possible with the lines. Okay. At this point, I'm going to measure the length and the width, which we already know is 30 centimeters. But I'm going to measure the length and then decide how large I want my fabric piece to be. I went and grabbed a yardstick with centimeters on it so that I don't have to convert and think about centimeters and inches to simplify it. If you don't have a yardstick with centimeters, then go with inches. So this is measuring 70.5 centimeters, but I know that when I cut and then brush these pieces, they're gonna stretch out a little bit. So I'm gonna go with 79 centimeters for my length, and that'll be the number I'm working with when I'm figuring out the size of the piece of fabric I want to use. So the width of pelt is 30 centimeters. The length is 79 centimeters. So I need the width of the piece of fabric to be 3 times the width of the pelt, because 3 times the width of the pelt that I'm using. So that'll bring us to 90 centimeters. And I'm going to place 1 strip every 3 centimeters. So it's going to be a 1 centimeter strip, 2 centimeters of space, a 1 centimeter strip, 2 centimeters of space, and so on. The length is going to be the same length as the length of the hide to start with, which is 79 centimeters. But we need to add extra around the fabric for, you could call it seam allowance or for a hem, but it's so that we can fold over and stitch down the raw edge of the fabric so that we have a nice, pretty, clean edge, versus if we left it raw, it'll unravel like that. So I have to decide how much I want to fold this over and then sew it down. It's difficult to work with a really small hem like that. It's easier to work with a larger hem. So I'm going to go with a fold over of 2 centimeters and then 2 centimeters. Let me just eyeball that and see what it looks like, pretending that this is my pelt. So that would be 4 centimeters of extra space. Fold over of, so this is 4, I need a smaller centimeter ruler. Okay, and this is just scrap fabric, so I'm going to mark right on it. That would be 2 centimeters and 2 centimeters. So if I fold it, right, if I fold it over 2 centimeters and then another 2 centimeters, that ends up being a lot closer to 6 centimeters. Right. This is why it's good to physically try out on scrap fabric as you're thinking through it. Because even though I've done this before, if I haven't done it in a long time, then it's kind of like the first time again. Okay. So in order to get a 2 centimeter hem, which is about what that is, then I need to add 6 centimeters. So I'll need to add 6 centimeters in each direction. So let's try it out and see what that looks like. Now, pretending that this is a mock-up of the finished blanket, I'm going to fold and pin all the sides just so I can see what it looks like. Now, this is not something that you have to do. It's just something that I like to do as I am thinking through how a project is going to work. Okay, so if we hem 6 centimeters in every direction, that would give us pretty much the exact dimensions on the inside as what the fur strips will be, and then a 2 centimeter border around the whole blanket, around the fur part of the blanket, which would be nice. And I do like that if we're looking at it like this way, the strips would run this direction going with the stripes. I do like that at the top and bottom, the hem would be right along the edge of the fur, but on the sides, if I hem the sides before I sew the fur on, then the fur strips are going to be right along this edge, which might make it a little bit difficult to sew. So I'd have to do that zigzag stitch on the hem and then the hide, hem, hide, hem, hide. So I'm just debating whether or not I want to do that or whether or not I want to add just a little bit more space so there would be a gap of fabric between the fur strip and the hem. And yeah, I think that that'll be fine, especially with a lightweight fabric. It's not super bulky. My needle and my machine is not going to have a problem sewing through this. So I'm going to go forward with adding 6 centimeters to each dimension. So because we're adding it to each dimension, we're actually adding 6 centimeters to the length here and here. So 6 centimeters times 2 is 12 centimeters. So we're adding 12 centimeters top and the bottom, and then, or 12 centimeters total to the length, and also 12 centimeters total to the width. 6 here, 6 here. So width plus seam allowance is 102 centimeters on the width. Length plus seam allowance is 91 centimeters. So those are going to be my dimensions for the fabric that I'm going to cut out, but I'm not going to cut out the fabric yet. It's just a good time to figure it out. Okay, so now I'm going to cut all the strips of fur apart. I'm going to change the blade on my furrier knife. I talk more about furrier knives in my other full tutorial videos. But if you don't want to buy a furrier knife, you can use a scalpel, a razor blade, X-Acto knife. Furrier blades are nice because they're very thin, and they're flexible because they're thin. The flexibility isn't really what makes them nice, it's just they're so thin, they're so sharp, and they cut the hide very easily. When you're cutting through the hide, you want to just use the tip of the blade to minimize how much hair is getting cut. And you never want to press and hold it to the table and then cut it like you would if you're cutting food on a cutting board, because then you'll cut off a whole bunch of hair and it'll look bad. We want to keep all the hair as long and fluffy as we can. Through this crinkled up area, I'm going to try and cut as straight as I can, and we'll fix it later after it's cut. I need to remember to follow this blue line because I made a mistake with that first black line. Okay, got a little wonky here as I was trying to figure out which line to use, so I'm going to clean that up a little bit. gonna do before totally cut that off. This is the side that starts with 1. So I'm gonna write 1 here, and this is the side that ends with 30. I'm gonna write 30 here. The hair gets a little sparse on the flank area right here, so I might need to kind of patch some in. And if I do, I want to remember which side matches which side without having to think too hard about it. Okay, don't throw away the scrap. Set it aside somewhere where you can grab it if you need it. And you don't have to keep the strips in order. We have them numbered so we can straighten them out later. If the hair is kind of matted together, try and hold on to the hairs and pull them apart rather than holding onto the hide so that you're not stretching the hide too much. I got a little sloppy on that cut. I'm not going to worry about it. That's okay. Halfway there. I'm going to change the blade. It's starting to drag a little bit. Okay. So I love it at this stage because it's so just light and fluffy and fun. All right, next step is brushing. Now we need to brush each one of these strips individually along both sides. Whenever you cut the hide, it always creates some loose hairs right along where you cut, no matter how careful you were with the knife. The goal is always to minimize how much loose hair there is, but there's always going to be some. So this is a brush from Samuel Bauer for your supply. I really like it. It's my favorite for doing stuff like this. I think these are like 25 bucks, 27, something like that. So it is on the pricey side. If you wanted a less expensive option, you could use a dog or cat brush that kind of looks like that with the wire teeth. I used to use a dog brush and I do like this one better. It's just a little bit more effective, but you know, whatever the budget allows. The sound that it makes on the table drives me crazy. So I use this, which is a pressing ham, which is meant for when you're ironing over curved seams. But it has a fabric that's got a nice tight weave so the brush doesn't catch in it. And I just use that kind of as a backing for the brush because it sounds better. It doesn't scrape. And we got to do this for every single strip. And you can see pretty clearly, brushed versus unbrushed, how much better it looks. It really improves the look and the fluffiness a lot. So it's definitely worth the time. And especially if you run into any matted areas, take your time, go slow, get out the mats. It'll look and feel better afterwards. Now I finished this side, I'm gonna flip it around and do the other side. If anyone can come up with a faster or easier way of doing this, let me know. I would definitely be open to suggestions. After doing the sides, I go back and brush it from the top also. And this pelt has some, not quite matting, but almost down at the rump area. So this is the rump part of this strip and this is the neck part. So to me it looks just a little like clumpy where the hair's almost matted. So I'm going to take my time and really try to get that brushed out well. So that looks a lot better to me. It's not as clumpy. We're getting some like fluffy lightness that I like. So once you're done brushing the strip, you need to defur your brush. It's pretty satisfying when it all comes out in a big clump like that. You might be wondering why I don't brush it like this to begin with. Like if you only brush it like this, is that sufficient? Not for me, because if I only brush it from the top, I'm getting some loose hairs, but there's still going to be a lot of loose hairs left on the sides and the cut edges. So I got out that much brushing from the top. If I go back, brush from the sides, I can see that there's loose hair there and that it didn't get out the knots in the hair. So that's significantly more hair and it looks better. This side is unbrushed, this side is brushed, and this side looks a lot better. Okay, now I need to do that for the other 29 of them. So put on some good music, put on an audiobook, set up a little card table in the living room, put on a good show, get comfortable, because it'll take a couple hours to get through all the brushing. I got all of the brushing done. So I have a very, very fluffy pile of all these little fur strips. And this is all of the loose hair that I brushed out. So it was definitely worth the time and effort of doing that. So the next thing I'm going to do is go through each one and see if there's any bald spots where the strips were cut closer to the edge of the pelt. Sometimes there's a bald spot on the flank area and sometimes also in the armpit area. So when I find one, I'm just going to set it aside. Here's another one. So we ended up with this pile that has some bald spots. So there's a couple options. You could leave them and then there would just be some noticeable bald looking spots on the blanket. You could not use these strips because they're from the very edges, so you just end up with a narrower blanket. Or we can try to repair them and find some fur to patch in there so that we don't see those as bald spots on the finished blanket, which is what I'm gonna do. Okay, I'm gonna flip them around so that the hair's all going the same direction. So we have neck, which is lighter, down to the rump fur. So this is the armpit area, and then this is the flank area. So I need some fill-in fur that is pretty much mostly gray through here like this. And then here we need some, ideally that would be kind of a gray to more of a beige. So I'm going to look at what was left over from the pelt and see if there's something we can sub in there. So yeah, pretty much right here would be good to use for either spot. It might end up being visible in the finished blanket, but I'd rather have a little bit of a visible patch than a bald spot. I'm gonna do just a rough estimate on how much I need. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 of those that are about probably 9 centimeters and less. So 6 pieces, 9 centimeters or less. And then over here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 pieces that are about 10 centimeters or less. And we need the direction of the hair to be going this way when we put those in. So I have to make sure I mark that on my pieces that I cut out. The pieces I cut out are going to be 1 centimeter wide. And before I cut any of those out, I want to take a look at these and see which ones have a lot of wrinkling in the armpit area to see if I need to do anything about that. This one has a lot. Pretty much just this one. This one has a tiny bit, but I don't think it's going to make that much of a difference. This one has a lot, but I'm going to cut some of it out right there. I'm going to set these aside for now and look at my scraps. So I was just looking at this piece next to this scrap and debating, could I use some of the neck to go in there? I don't think so, because that's really light. And I don't want to use this, and then that's kind of our bald area. So can I use this to go in there? It's not perfect, but it's probably the best we've got. So this section here, I'm going to cut into 1 centimeter wide strips. So that's also the best we have to fill in here. I'm going to mark a squiggly line on the top so I know that that's the top and that's the bottom, because when I cut out this section it'll be harder to tell the direction of the fur. And now these need to be brushed out. Okay, so we're going to see how much we can fill in with these guys. I marked that little squiggly line on the top so that I can tell which way's the top. It's hard to tell once these are brushed out. Okay, so these are all laid out top to bottom. So we have the direction of the hair going the correct way. There's not much of, like, if you consider this the vertical direction, there's not much of a horizontal directional difference. So I'm okay with using these on to fill in either side of the pelt. Okay, so we know we need to fill in these gaps, and it's a little less fluffy up here and a little more fluffy down here. So I'm going to find the less fluffy pieces that I cut out and use those on the top. That one's a little more fluffy. This one's less fluffy. That one's a little bit more fluffy. I'm just going to cut out the gap where I need to. Then I'm going to measure it and cut out a piece from my scrap that is the same length. We don't even really need to measure it, just hold it next to it and cut the new piece the same length. Don't lose track of which are your fill-in pieces and which are your full-length pieces. That's placed there, but I need my clips. Okay. So we need to clip this right side to right side so that we don't lose track of it. And if you have a fur sewing machine, you could sew across that with the fur sewing machine at a 0 seam allowance. Instead of doing that, I'll show you how I do it on the regular sewing machine, but the idea is that I'm going to be zigzagging along the edge here. Once I get to the place where I'm integrating my little replacement piece, I'm going to butt the ends together and then continue my zigzag. The zigzag is going to hold it down. It's a narrow enough strip that you're not going to see that little space in the middle. We just need to make sure that it's held down to the blanket. Okay, so there's one piece. And then there's another gap there, but for that one, I want to use one of these fluffier pieces. And this looks good enough. On this piece, that end is a little bit wide, so I'm just going to start here. Right sides together, clip. Right sides, yep, that's the little end piece. Right sides together, clip. Okay. Now we do the same thing for the rest of these. Okay, and this one has some of those extra wrinkles there. So I'm going to cut that higher than I need to so I can cut off this wrinkly area. I just did what you're not supposed to do, which is cut out the piece and then discard it without cutting a new piece. So hold it in your hand until you have a new piece so that you know how long to cut it. I'm not going to stretch this out while I measure because I don't want the whole piece's length to end up too long. And really, we're going for pretty good, close enough. We're not going for perfect. The top of this one's good. I'm not going to bother with that area, but we still need to replace this. So I was really hoping I could do this whole patching thing without having to cut anything off of the other side of the pelt scrap. I still might be able to. We'll see. Okay, I'm calling it close enough. good enough for me. Okay, so we have all the strips cut and brushed. We have the strips repaired that needed to be repaired. And now, before we can sew them onto the fabric, we need to at least have the fabric cut out. One thing about brushing is when you brush the fur, the strips stretch a little bit. It's just kind of inevitable. So I want to go through and check some of these and see how long they ended up compared to our original 79 centimeters of length. Actually, this one's right on, which I expected it to be pretty good because it looks like that's a lot of hair from the spine, and right down the center of the pelt where the spine is where the hide is the strongest and the least likely to stretch. This one made it up to 83. And this one, 79, so that's right on. $79. Okay, so we definitely have some that are 79, which is right on with what we wanted. This one's 81. We have some that stretched. So what I should have done is, before cutting and adding in these little splices, I should have measured the whole piece and trimmed it off. Now it's just more difficult to measure because I have these clipped, and even if I unclip it and lay the pieces out, the measurement's not really going to be that accurate. So we know that some of these lengths are different than others, and we'll correct that as we sew them down. Basically, sew down a strip, trim off any excess that's on the end, rather than having to measure and correct all of them individually. Now we need to finalize what size fabric to cut out. So we have the width of the pelt at 30 centimeters, the length of the pelt at 79 centimeters, and then the width of the fabric, which needs to be 3 times the width of the pelt. So that brings us from 30 centimeters to 90 centimeters. And then the length of the pelt was 79 centimeters, so that's the same for the fabric, but we need to add hemming allowance, which ended up being 6 centimeters on all sides. So 6 centimeters times 2 is 12 centimeters to the length and the width. So that brings us from 90 centimeters for the width to 102 centimeters, and from 79 centimeters for the width to 91 centimeters. Or sorry, for the length. 79 to 91 for the length. Now if we do that, I'll be sewing the edge of the strips directly next to or onto the edge of this hem. And for making the first blanket, I do know that I'm going to hem these sides and the bottom, but not the top. My goal with that is to have the top of the fur strips and just underneath where that hem's gonna sit, and then fold it and stitch it down after I finish sewing the strips on the blanket. The reason for that is, of course, it doesn't really look like it right now, but on the first blanket I did, the direction of the neck hair was very much directionally this way, and so you could see that raw edge of the leather when all the strips were sewn on, and it didn't look very nice. So by folding over the hem and sewing it on top, it gives it a really nice clean look when it's finished. So that's what we're going to do this time. So set your fur aside and get out your fabric. So you get out your fabric, now we need to cut it to size. One key thing when you're selecting a fabric for this project that will make it a lot easier is if you choose a fabric that has some sort of a stripe pattern on it. And this fabric is a lightweight wool suiting fabric that I got from moodfabrics.com. This is fabric that you would use to make suits, like men's suits. So it's kind of a nice lightweight fabric. It happens to be wool, which I love. It also has a nice drape to it, which just means that if you hold it up, it drapes nicely as opposed to being stiff, having more of a stiffness to it. Just for an example of a fabric that doesn't have a lot of drape, this is also wool, but you can see how it just kind of holds its shape, whereas this moves nicely and drapes and has some kind of fluid movement to it, which will be nice to get that like flowiness in the blanket. If you use a stiffer fabric, then your blanket will be a little bit more stiff. If you use a fabric with more drape, then your blanket will end up being more drapey. But the stripes are important because it gives you something to line up your fur strips against when you're sewing. The size of the stripes doesn't really matter that much because we're not using the stripes for measuring. It's more for just a visual mark when we're sewing to keep lines straight. So when we're cutting out a big square or rectangle of fabric, it's important to choose the right place to use as your straight edge. And with fabric, the cut edge or the raw edge was what was previously cut, is not necessarily square or straight. The selvage edge, which is on either side of the fabrics, there's a selvage edge over here and a selvage edge here. This is where on the knitting machine or the loom, the weaving machine, the fabric was tacked down and then all the fibers were run back and forth from side to side. So we know that either selvage edge is straight, and that is what we'll use as our guide to square up the rest of our cuts. So I'm gonna get this selvage edge here straight with this line on my cutting mat. Then I'm also going to use some pattern weights to hold it down so that as I'm manipulating the rest of the fabric, I can maintain the straight line. I'm doing this rather gently. I'm not like stretching and pulling on the fabric. And in my opinion, cutting a large piece of fabric into a rectangle or square is one of the hardest things to do. Fabric can want to, my dad would call it matchbox, where you have something square and it just kind of wants to angle over either way. So the stripes help with that also, because I can eyeball the stripes and make sure that they're straight, mostly straight all the way down my fabric. So this looks pretty good to start with. Need to find my measurements again. Okay, so my measurements are 91 centimeters on the length, which will bring us here. And I'm gonna add a little bit of leeway. I'm gonna make it 92 centimeters on the length. And chalk is good to use for marking the fabric because it won't, you can kind of brush it off afterwards, but you'll be able to see it while you're cutting out the pieces. My bottom cut line here looks pretty straight, so I'm going to trust that that's straight and just mark up my 92 centimeters at the top here. If your bottom line was not straight, then you'd want to move up and have 91 centimeters from like here to here so that you can make sure both your bottom cut line and top cut line are straight and square with the rest of the fabric. And then 92 centimeters on this side. I'm going to draw my line across, matching up those two marks. Okay, so I more or less have 3 lines ready. Top line, side line, bottom line. So now I need to measure my width this way. My width is 102 centimeters, which is a little bit wider than my table. I need to scooch this over and then measure out 102 centimeters wide. So to make sure that I'm keeping everything square, I'm gonna line up this edge here where the color changes from the selvage to the body of the fabric with the edge of my table. Okay, I think that's about as square as it's going to be. So meter stick is 100 centimeters. And I'm measuring from this color change over that way. So 102. Here, and I'm going to measure at a couple points so I can get a straight line. Remember that you can use the stripes on your fabric to keep things square. Might be hard to see the line, but I have a line drawn here. I have a line drawn across there. And then I'm also going to cut off this little edge. Okay. My fabric cut out. That, in my opinion, is the hardest part of this whole process. Is it perfectly square? Maybe not. Is it good enough? Yeah, I think so. Optional but recommended. I do recommend you iron your fabric so that it's nice and flat. If it's thin fabric, you can actually fold it and iron 2 layers at the same time. And when you're ironing, you want to make sure you're ironing on the wrong side of the fabric. So fabrics have a right side and a wrong side. The right side of the fabric is the side that you want to be visible on your finished product, which in this case will be the side of the blanket that has the fur on, will be the wrong side of the blanket. For us, the right side will be the back side of the blanket where there's no fur, because that's going to be the most visible portion of the fabric. Normally, how you can tell right side versus wrong side is how it looks on either side of the fabric. This is a really obvious fabric for right side and wrong side. The right side of the fabric is this velvety side. The wrong side is this white, ugly side. Right side, wrong side. Some fabrics don't have a very visible right side and wrong side. Some fabrics don't even really have a right side and wrong side at all. This fabric on the wrong side has these little tiny knots where the lengths of thread or yarn that were used to weave the fabric are joined together, and they all stick out on the wrong side of this fabric. So this is the right side. Let's see, we have one little blemish right here, and that looks like it's just a little snag in the fabric and not a knot. And then on this side, which I believe is the wrong side, there's a little knot here. And a little knot here. And here. Okay. But other than that, those little tiny knots, the fabric looks the same on both sides. That's how I'm determining that this side that's up with the little knots is the wrong side. So I'm going to fold this right sides together so that as I'm ironing on the wrong side, because the iron can leave little marks on the fabric, and if they're on the wrong side of the fabric, you won't be able to see them in the finished product anyway. And I just have a little ironing mat, and this is just a cheap iron from Amazon that's intended for ironing like vinyl decals onto t-shirts and stuff. I don't really like the point on an iron, so I got this one. Use what you have. Use a setting that's appropriate for your fabric. And you'll notice this iron doesn't have any steam. I've had problems with steam irons just leaking water out of the holes in the bottom. So I got this one partially because it doesn't have any steam, and then I use a spray bottle to spritz the fabric, and then the heat from the iron creates steam on its own rather than like shooting the steam out of the iron. And that's just what I like to use. So while the iron heats up, I'm going to give this just a light misting, and then I'm going to press this fabric, and I'm not going to press along this folded edge because I don't want to press in a fold. So for me, I know the iron's ready if it sizzles. So that's good. When you are ironing or pressing a fabric, you don't want to slide the iron around because it can distort the fabric. You can stretch it in ways that you don't want it stretched. So you kind of put your fabric down gently and then lift and move the iron each time. Don't drag it across the fabric. Now I'm not going to press right on this fold because I don't want to press it into the fabric. So I'm going to press next to it, and then the last thing I'm going to do is open it up and press that so that's flat too on one layer. So if I did it right, then this other side should be pretty well pressed. That's pretty good. So a few little touch-ups that I need to do, but not the whole thing. I'm not going to spritz more water because there's a little bit that absorbed when I sprayed the top side, and I don't want to have to press the whole thing. I just want to focus on these spots. So I'll see if I can do it without spraying any more water. It's not flattening as much as I want it to, so I will spray a little bit. Okay, this is not flattening the way I want it to, so I'm going to open it up and just do one layer, still making sure that I'm pressing on the wrong side. Let's see if this works any better. I can do this crease line too while I'm here. Okay, that's good enough. I'm happy with that. So now that we have it pressed, the next thing I want to do is hem the edges. And if you remember, I want to hem the sides and the bottom, but not the top. I'm going to hem the top after I have all the first strips sewn on. So I'm doing a 2 centimeter double fold, which if you just leave that corners like this, you end up with a really bulky corner and it's a little bit hard to sew through. So there's a trick to getting the corner nice and neat. I'm going to do this one with a marker so that you can see it, but chalk would be a better option. So I need to mark 2 centimeters from the edge and then 4 centimeters from the edge. I'm going to do it a little further down too. 2 centimeters, 4 centimeters, and from this edge, two centimeters, 4 centimeters. And this isn't cut perfectly straight here. I can see that this is wider here and narrower here. So I'm gonna measure this as if this spot was as wide as this. So that is about 7 millimeters higher than where this stripe line is. Okay, so about there. There. And I need to draw some lines across here. I don't have to go really far, just through the corners, the main the main place where I need them. And then I need a diagonal line through here. And this is the portion that I'm going to cut off. Need the same lines drawn on the other side. So, and then the side. If you don't use chalk, then these lines will show up on your finished blanket. Okay. So we need to fold over this little corner until the lines that we drew on the right side of the fabric match the lines that we drew on the wrong side of the fabric. And then that'll get a double fold. That, and this will get a double fold. That, and if we do it right, we get a nice, very pretty looking corner. So I'm going to press that, and it might take a little bit of fiddling to get it to look just right, but that's the goal. There we go. That is a beautiful corner. So I'm going to go around and press the double fold into the rest of the blanket, the fabric, and do the same thing on the other corners. Okay, so because of the way I measured and cut this, I know that the stripes are running from bottom to top, top to bottom on this fabric. So since I already started hemming this here, this will be the bottom and this will be the top. But I don't want to stitch it down because I want to do the stitching after I've sewn on the fur. So I'll iron the whole thing, but I'm not going to stitch the hem down on the top edge. So the most correct way would be to measure each fold as I'm folding it and make sure that it's hitting the 2 centimeters that I want. I generally prefer just to eyeball it, so you can do what you want. So we're going to measure one fold at 1 centimeter and press it, and then fold again and press it. And that will hide the raw edge. is distorting my cutting mat a little bit, so I'm just going to put this heat-proof pad where I keep pressing. Okay, so I got everything pressed. Now I'm going to go through and pin the sides that I want to sew. So I'm not going to pin the top side, which is down here. I'm going to pin this, which is, I've decided, is the bottom. And that way I won't accidentally sew the top. Okay, so now I have it pinned on 3 sides. And it's not pinned on the top. So one of the more useful things I've learned over the years is that you don't need to have every color of thread in your sewing space, in your studio. You can match pretty closely just about any fabric you're sewing on if you have a black thread, an ivory thread, a mauve thread, and a gray thread. It's not going to be a perfect match, but is anybody really going to get up close to you to see if the thread matches the color of the fabric you're wearing? No. So for the most part, these are the colors of thread I keep, and that's pretty much it for sewing fabric. For sewing fur, I also use a brown, but for fabric, this is all I have on hand. It reduces cost because you're not buying a thread every time you buy a new piece of fabric, and it simplifies keeping enough thread on hand because I know I always have this, although apparently I'm out of gray because I can't find my big gray cone right now. This is just standard polyester home sewing machine thread in a larger quantity. So normally it would come on a spool like this if you bought it from a fabric store. This is just a larger quantity of home sewing machine thread. So this is what I would use for most things when I'm sewing fabric. And even for sewing fur, it's a good thread to start with. So these are a viscose thread. I believe they're sold as an embroidery thread. It's a little bit thinner and finer compared to the polyester thread, which probably is hard to see on the camera. But it also has a softer feel to it. So when I did the first blanket like this, I started off using polyester thread, and I noticed that on the back side of the fabric where I could feel that zigzag stitch, it felt more rough. So I ended up switching to this viscose thread, embroidery thread, and it felt a lot smoother on the back. So I'm going to use this for this project. I have to decide what color to use. So definitely not the black, and I don't really like the gray either. So I'm kind of between the pink and the mauve and the ivory. I think I'm gonna go with the mauve. The ivory is so bright and shiny that it really stands out. The mauve is gonna blend in a little bit more. If you want to get a matching thread, obviously you do you, but I don't like to have to deal with having a whole bunch of thread to store and keep track of, so this is what I do. So when I get over to the sewing machine, I'm going to sew around these 3 sides, starting on one corner next to the top where I'm not going to sew. I'm going to sew along the edge. I'm going to go all the way around, but when I get to these mitered corners, if I just sew along the edge here and then continue there, it's gonna leave that like little pocket there. So I'm gonna sew along the edge and then up the edge of this fold here and across, down the edge of that fold, and then back to the edge there, just to make sure that that is held down nicely. And none of these corners ended up super duper perfect. That has a little bit of a gap at the top there, but it's good enough. I'm happy with that. So I'm gonna go ahead and start sewing. I have my stitch length set to 3.5 millimeters. I'm doing a straight stitch. I'm gonna sew right along the edge here, just about as close as I can to the edge. If you're not as confident, then sew a little farther away from the edge, because then there's more room for error. I'm not gonna go through the details of how to use a regular sewing machine. There's a lot of resources and tutorials online that will be applicable to whatever home sewing machine you have. But I am using the viscose thread, like I talked about, and a universal needle. If I have trouble with the needle, either skipping stitches or like thread bunching up underneath the fabric, then I'll change out the needle and try something else. But for now, I'm starting with a universal needle. Make sure you start your projects with a back stitch. And take out your pins before you sew over them. If you sew over your pins routinely, you could end up hitting it with the needle and breaking your needle, which can fly into your eyeball if you're really unlucky, but it can also throw off the timing of your machine. So as I showed you before, I started sewing on the corner of that fold, and then I pivoted and I'm going to sew along this edge. That actually looks a little bit long for the stitch length that I want on this project. So I'm going to go down to 2.5 millimeters for the stitch length. So now that I'm to this corner, I'm going to sew up to here, and then along this edge, pivot over, down that edge, and then continue along the long edge. That way I'm tacking down my mitered corner so it looks as good as it can. So one of the tricks to sewing straight, if you're sewing a long straight line, is you never watch the needle. You watch the edge of your fabric, which I'm looking at this part here, against a landmark. So this foot has a notch right in front of the needle, and I'm trying to keep this fabric about halfway in between the edge of this plastic and that notch. So as I'm sewing, I'm not looking at the needle and I'm not looking at this edge. I'm looking right here to make sure that I'm keeping this edge here. Okay, so I made it to the end of where I want to sew. I'm going to leave that top edge unsewn. Now I just need to go back and trim off any loose threads at the start and stop. And the corners turned out pretty good. Not like perfect, otherwise that edge would be completely closed, but I am very happy with that. Once I've done 100 or so of them, then I can try for perfect, but I don't do them that often, so I'm very happy with that. Now we need to mark out where we're going to place all of the fur strips. So to find the center, rather than measuring, I'm just going to fold this in half and then mark it with chalk. You know what? Just to make it more visible on the camera, I'm going to use my brown marker again. Okay, that is my center. And I have 30 strips of Coyote to sew on. And I want to sew one every 3 centimeters. I'm going to start from the center. And I'm actually going to center this mark a little bit more on this stripe here. I'm going to mark over 1.5 centimeters and then every 3 centimeters. Same thing this side, 1.5 centimeters and then every 3 centimeters. And this is going to end up tucked under there. So the place where I want to end my stitching is actually right about here. So this is where I'm going to make my marks. Because I'm going to sew my strip down here, and then I want to be able to fold this over the very top of that strip. Okay, so if I did everything right, I should have 30 little hash marks. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 9, 30. Good. Disregard the center mark because that's going to be a gap in between 2 strips of fur. And now I need to do the same marks on the bottom. And I'm going to mark this with chalk. And then I want to lay this out and follow this stripe down to make sure that it's the same stripe my center mark is on. Pretty much. I'm going to mark the center of this stripe because that's where I marked the center on the top, and that way it's staying consistent. And again, if you're doing this at home, use chalk because this marker won't come off. Okay, so now same thing here. I'm going to mark 1.5 centimeters away from this center mark this way, and then every 3 centimeters, 1.5 centimeters from here, and then every 3 centimeters. So if we look at the marks on the bottom here, I started in the center and I made sure the center matched up with the center on the top, and then I counted out. If we look at this side, my last mark is right on the edge here on this side, and on this side my last mark is a bit away from the edge here. But if we look at the top, this mark here is really just 1 centimeter away from this edge, and this mark here on this side is maybe 1.5 centimeters away from the edge, so pretty close to even. So what happened? When I look at the side, I can follow this line from this mark down to here. So I know this is straight. This line all the way down to here. So I know that that's straight. So what must have happened is my fabric was cut just a little bit off square, and that results in having a wider gap here, a wider gap here compared to here. I'm not going to do anything about it. I don't think it's going to be that noticeable on the finished blanket. One way to avoid that would be once you have your piece of fabric cut out, hopefully it has stripes on it because that makes it easier. Follow the stripe that's right along the edge and see how straight it is. So this blanket probably, as I was cutting it, this stripe kind of, the stripes on this side probably stick out a little bit, and as you go this way the stripes are getting cut off a little bit, so it was just cut out unevenly. I'm not going to worry about it. I'm going to leave it. I don't think it's going to show that much in the finished product. And as I said, this is the second blanket I've made in this style, so there's still a little bit of trial and error and figuring things out. You guys are along for the ride on that. And on this side, I think the reason why this looks uneven, this gap compared to this gap, is because this got folded a little bit too much. The edge of this should be back here, and then the gaps would look pretty even. But again, I'm going to leave it. I'm not going to stress about it. It's going to be good enough, even if it's not perfect. Now we have 3 sides hemmed, top is not hemmed, and I'm ready to start sewing fur down. So my order of operations is going to be to organize the fur strips by number, numerical order, and then I'm going to start on this side with number 1. This is not number 1, but just for demonstration. And I'm going to line it up with the mark that's at the top here on the center of the strip. Center of the strip is going to line up with the center of that mark. And then I'm gonna zigzag down one side, and we'll have a close-up of that on the sewing machine. And then turn it around and zigzag stitch up the other side on the regular sewing machine. And one reason I wanted the fabric to be striped is so that as I'm sewing along, I can keep the edge of the strip lined up with wherever the edge falls in the stripe pattern. So in this case, the edge of my hide strip is about 1/4 of an inch away from the edge of this stripe. So that's the distance I'm going to try to maintain as I sew down this whole thing. Now, some of the strips have stretched from brushing. Some have stretched more than others. So what I'm going to do to make them end up at the same length is start at the top, sew down, and then if I need to, I'm going to cut off a little bit at the end of the strip and leave it like that. There's nothing really fancy or complicated about it. That's just how I'm going to make sure that all the strips end up the same length. So I'm going to set the fabric aside for now. I'm going to get all of the first strips organized in numerical order, make sure that I have all of them. I haven't dropped any on the ground anywhere. And then we're going to move to the sewing machine and start sewing. So you will need some of your fabric that you're using for the blanket and some thin strips of fur. So I still have some scrap fur here. I'm going to cut some of the scrap fur in roughly about 1 centimeter cuts so that I can test out my stitching on this scrap and figure out the size of the zigzag that I want, the width of the zigzag, how it's going to look on the back side, and troubleshoot that on the scrap rather than on the blanket. Okay, not perfectly straight, but good enough for testing. I'm not going to bother brushing these. I just want to be able to do the test stitches to the machine. Okay, so I'm setting my machine to a zigzag stitch, and the preset settings are 1.5 millimeter wide zigzag and 3.5 millimeters between each stitch. So I'm going to try that and see how it looks. And so I know that my machine does a zigzag stitch on either side of the center mark on this foot. So this foot has a little notch here that marks the center, and the zigzag is going to fall on either side of that. So I want to keep the hide lined up with that notch. It would be easier to see if there's a better contrast in color between the hide and the fabric, but unfortunately, this is what we have to work with. So I'm gonna just do a few stitches and then see how it looks. Okay, I can already tell that's too narrow. Because it's barely even a zigzag. It's almost a straight line. So I'm going to bump up to 3.5 millimeters wide, and we'll leave it at 3.5 millimeters between each stitch, and we'll see how that looks. Okay, the width is much better there. But for the sake of comparison, I'm gonna change, sorry, the width is much better there. The length looks pretty good, but I want to see what it looks like if I have the stitches closer together. So now I'm still at 3.5 millimeters wide on the stitch width and down to 2.5 millimeters on the stitch length. Get to the end of the line here. So I'm going to cut my thread and take a look. So this section here was the 3.5 width and 3.5 length. And then this section here was the 3.5 width and 2.5 length. And I do like the look of that 3.5 width, 2.5 length better. So I'm going to go with that. I'm going to stitch up the other side of this and practice how I'm going to start and end my stitching. So on the previous blanket I did, I backstitched with a zigzag and then stitched forward with a zigzag, and it looked kind of messy, and I'll show you how that looks. To do that, I started sewing 3/4 of an inch, half an inch, something like that from the edge, and then I backstitched. Some machines have a lever to pull when you need to backstitch. This one just has a button. And then I stitched forward. And continued to the end. And then when I got to the end, I backstitched again. But it looked pretty messy. So on this one, I want to try doing a straight stitch for the back stitch. So I just changed this to a straight stitch. A straight stitch is also less likely to unravel at the end of a project. A zigzag stitch is a little bit looser, and so it just wants to unravel more. Like you can see just a little bit of pressure on that zigzag and it's coming out. That was my first line of stitching. So this is the second line of stitching on the top here, and this actually turned out pretty neat, neater than usual. It doesn't usually zigzag into the same holes it did when you were starting, but this one did. So that actually looks pretty neat, but it's definitely rougher feeling than the rest of the zigzag stitch. Now here is where I did the zigzag and then the back stitch with a straight stitch. And to me, that looks much nicer. And then I also know that it's going to be less likely to try and back out and undo the stitching just with regular use and wear. So I'm going to go with that, with a straight stitch back stitch and then a zigzag. Okay, I'm happy with this for test stitching. I'm going to switch back to a zigzag, set at 3.5 width, 2.5 length. And I'm going to get started on the actual blanket. So I have piece number 1. And the top of the blanket is the part that's unhemmed. So you do have to be careful when you're sewing that you don't accidentally get a fold of fabric from somewhere else underneath where you're sewing. So then if I sewed over this right here, I would sew down the extra fabric. So one way to help avoid that is to lay out your fabric and just kind of roll it up on the side that you're not using. And that'll keep it neat and tucked out of the way so you don't accidentally sew it into your project and have to seam rip it out. Okay, so that's a little bit neater. Starting right at the top here, my number one piece of fabric, and if you're using Coyote, the neck fur is usually lighter and the rump fur is usually darker. Also, I guess it's not so obvious, but on this piece, but the direction of the hair on the rump is always going down, and on the neck, there's kind of like a little swoop this way, and then it goes off the hide, versus on the rump, it just goes straight off the edge. So that's one way, a couple different ways you can tell between the top and the bottom of the piece. If you're not sure, you'll be able to tell once you get to the sewing part. You could mark them somehow on the top, either with like a circle or a T or something. So I'm going to line this strip up, the center of the strip, with that center mark. And then I'm going to try to keep this positioned so that the edge of the hide is about 1/4 of an inch away from this stripe line. And that's how I'm going to maintain straightness as I'm sewing. And since we're at the top here, I don't need to back stitch at the top. And I'd say the hardest part is getting started on your stitching. So I'm going to stitch about to here, and then I need to get the hair moved over again. And that's going to be the rhythm of sewing this on, is we're going to sew a little bit, and then scooch the hair over. Make sure my distance is consistent. And then sew more. If you are less confident or not confident in your ability to sew straight, you could make your zigzag stitch wider than I have. So my width is 3.5 millimeters. You could go up to 4, 4.5, 5 millimeters wide to make sure that if you deviate a little bit, you'll still catch the edge of the hide. But if your zigzag's wider, it'll hold down more of the fur, so it might not give as fluffy of a look. I'm getting close to one of those spots where I had to patch in some extra fur. So I'm going to take that clip out now and keep this handy, but close. I'm just going to sew to the end here, or almost to the end. And it's definitely going to feel like you don't have enough hands, but just go slow and take your time and you'll get the hang of it. Okay, so now I'm really close to where I need to tie this in. And I'm I'm just going to butt these ends up next to each other as close as I can get them. Could even overlap a little bit and tuck this bottom one under the top one. And it's the hair up here under my foot, it's getting in the way, so I'm going to use a seam ripper to push that out of the way. And then I'm going to sew continuously right on to my strip that I'm adding in. And now they're joined. And I have scooched a little bit too close to this line, so I'm going to work on correcting that a little gradually. By just scooching that a little farther away from this line. Now we are to the next join. And looking at this, I actually overcorrected and now I'm too far to the left. So I'm just going to bring it back to the right a little bit. But I'm not really stressed about it. It's not going to be that apparent in the finished blanket. And especially if it's the first one you're making, this is the second one I'm making, then that's okay. You can be perfect when you make the 100th one. So this is pretty tedious and boring. It's a good time to put on a good audiobook or music, podcast, whatever. Watch a show on your phone, or I guess listen to a show on your phone, because you're going to be here a while. So once we get to the end, I'm going to trim this off right where it's going to end, just before we're just at that hemmed bit. And rather than keeping a furrier blade at the table, I'm going to use scissors, and I slide the scissors in so that they're only against the hide and ideally not really cutting any fur. You cut a little bit of fur, but not a lot. You can use a furrier knife if you would prefer. Down at the rump is where the hair gets harder to push out of the way because it's thicker and fluffier. Okay, so now I'm at the point where I need to back stitch. So I'm going to go back to a straight stitch, and I'm going to set that actually kind of the opposite of my settings for my zigzag. This one I'm going to have the needle at the 3.5 millimeter mark, which will make the needle end up in the center, and then my stitch length will be 2.5 millimeters. And I'm going to go 5 stitches and then do a couple stitches in place, and then I'm going to cut the thread. Okay, so I sewed down the first line. I'm going to turn around the whole project and stitch up this side. So I have this one side done. Now I need to stitch down this other side. And I still have my straight stitch programmed. So I'm going to start with a straight stitch. And I'm starting 1/2 to 3/4 of an inch from the edge, not the edge of the fabric, but the edge of the hide strip. And then once I get to the end, I'm going to go to my zigzag, and I had that at 3.5 millimeters wide, 2.5 millimeters between each stitch. And the second side's always easier because the strip, you don't have to worry so much about keeping the strip straight, because it already is, because it's held in place by our first line of stitching. And then I also find it a little easier to sew against the grain of the hair. You can see where this join is, where I was adding in this extra bit of fur to replace that bald area. And it looks like it may look a little bald. So what I'm going to do to try and hide that is hold some of the hair from here down on top of this, so that when I zigzag over it, it's going to catch a little bit of that and make it just stand up more to try and hide that place where those two pieces come together. So at this point here is where the two pieces are joining from where I patched in some fur, and the edges aren't quite going to meet because this is narrower than this. I'm going to take my scissors, I'm going to trim this off a little bit on an angle so that it'll match up better with that piece. And again, trying to minimize how much fur I was cutting. So that matches up a little bit better. It'll be just a little bit more gradual. And in this case, this has a little bit less hair density on this part of the strip that's meeting compared to this part. So instead of pulling the hair up like I did on the other one, I'm going to push it kind of down and back a little bit. So to help this cover up this area where it joins. I'm at the end on the top here, so I don't need to backstitch. I'm going to cut the thread, and now I can show you what it'll look like when this is folded over and stitched down. So it's just covering up a little bit of the end of that so that on the finished blanket you don't see that raw edge of the hide. It'll look like that, which just looks neater. So for piece number 2, I'm going to turn the whole thing around again. So I'm starting at the top and then find strip number 2, the top end, and we're going to do the same thing. Match up the center of the hide with that mark. And now when I'm stitching, this is the amount of space that I want to leave between the hide and that line on the fabric. That's, I don't know, less than 1/4 inch, more than 1/8 of an inch. So this one doesn't need to be trimmed at all. It's a touch short, but I'm not going to worry about that. Sew to the end and then switch back to my straight stitch at 3.5 and 2.5. Back stitch 5 stitches or so, and then I did some stitches in place at the end. Cut the thread, turn it around, and then sew this side. Now this gets a little bit more tricky because not only do I have to make sure this hair is out of the way when I'm sewing, I also have to make sure this hair is out of the way. So it's just a little bit more tricky. Okay, straight stitch, back stitch, and then switch back to my zigzag. And that's how it'll look when we fold it over and stitch that last stitch across the top to hem it. So that is 2 strips down. We're going to turn it around, start on number 3, And then it's just the same thing over and over and over 28 more times. So I'm about halfway done with sewing on the strips. And once you get to the point where there's a lot of bulk on the fur end, it gets a little bit harder to sew, and you might need to roll up the fur side when you're sewing up the second side of the fur strips so that it fits in your machine throat space and makes it easier to sew. All right, so the blanket is almost done. All the fur is sewn on, but still have to hem this top edge. I still have a pretty good fold line from where I pressed it. But before I sew that down, I'm going to go through and snip off all of my loose threads. There's some on the top of the blanket, there's some on the back side of the blanket, and then also some on the bottom of the blanket. Thread snips are really good for this. With a long pair of scissors, you're more likely to cut some fur or something else that you really don't want to cut. There's all those threads I need to snip off. I'm not sure how visible it will be, but at the start, which was over here, at the start of the top, I was doing a zigzag stitch and then just ending it. And that ended up pretty loose. You can see here it wants to back out pretty easily. So once I saw that, I ended up switching to starting with a straight stitch back stitch, I think 2.5 millimeter length, and then doing the zigzag, and that looks a lot neater and it's much less likely to want to unravel. And this is the top, so this is where we will fold over and sew that down. So I will have a line of stitching here that will end up crossing over this and kind of seal those stitches down a little bit, but it still wants to back out above where that will be. So that ended up being a cleaner look to do the back stitching with the straight stitch and then the zigzag. Which is the same thing that I did along the bottom edge. Okay, I think I got all of the little thread tails. So the last major step for the blanket is to fold over this hem and then sew across that top and these corners. If your fabric is fraying like mine, go through first and snip off those little threads. That way they don't end up sticking out. Let's do that double fold. Get your corners nice and lined up. And this will be a little tricky because you have to keep the hair out of the way, but it's no more trickier than what we've already done sewing the rest of the blanket. Make sure you're putting pins through where there's no hide on the back side, so it'll be hard to get pins through the hide. Okay, this crease didn't hold quite the way I hoped it would. It's not looking as creased as I want it to. So I'm gonna get my iron ready and I'm gonna press just this crease here. I don't wanna get too far and overlap this whole area of the hem because we have some hide under there and it can't handle the high heat of an iron. I don't wanna iron over my pins because if they have plastic heads, they'll melt and that makes a mess on the iron. But I also don't want to take out all of my pins because they're holding the hem down nicely. So I'm just going to take out a couple at a time and press that little section really close to the edge. And then as I move down the line, I'll put pins back in. I'm catching just the edge of that fold to press this crease to hold it in place better. Now it's really holding a crease. I was kind of antsy on this end and started pressing this before the iron was hot enough. That's looking better. I'm happy with how that looks. Now I'm going to take it to the machine and I'm going to sew this side of the corner. So I've already sewn this side. Actually, I'm probably going to start like here and sew backwards and then cross over between the two sides and then back over and then down that angle and along the edge here. And I'm going to be trying to get really close to the edge like I did when I hemmed the other three sides. So if I would have been thinking at the time, I would have written down the stitch length that I used for the rest of the hem, but unfortunately I did not. So I think it was a 3.5mm stitch length, and I know I had the needle lined up with the center of the foot. So my game plan is to start back stitching along here, cross over and back, and then straight stitch down that angle and then along the rest of the line across the top. And if my stitch length looks really off, then I'll just adjust it. It does look too long. I'm going to go down to 3mm on the stitch length. Make sure that you're not sewing over your pins. If you sew over pins, You can throw your machine out of timing if the needle hits it. It can also break the needle and fly into your eyeball, which we definitely don't want. So we're going to sew right along there. I have the needle lined up with the middle of the foot, and then I have the edge of my fabric lined up in the middle of this gap in the foot here and the center notch. So my goal is to keep the fabric right here. And as I'm sewing along, and when I keep my line straight, I'm watching the fabric here, not the needle. I don't expect it to have any trouble sewing through the places where there's fur and hide, because we already did that zigzag on all the hides, on all the strips, and it worked just fine. And as you're sewing, be careful that you're not getting a fold from underneath, under the foot. You'll probably feel it because at this point it would be really bulky, but that's really annoying when you sew over a fold and then you have to seam rip your stitches to fix it. As I'm sewing along, this top layer that's folded is stretching a little bit, so I'm getting a little bit of a bubble here, and that is likely to just get worse as I continue sewing. There's probably a couple things at play. One is that when I cut this top edge, I think it was not perfectly straight. It was bowed out a little bit at one point, which would create some extra width here when we do the folds. The other is that when you're sewing on a regular sewing machine, whatever the top layer is has a tendency to stretch more than the bottom layer because of the pressure and resistance of the presser foot. So it's kind of pushing this little extra bump forward along as we sew. And I want to work on correcting that kind of a little bit at a time. So I'm going to take some of this extra length and kind of hold it back towards the needle there. Just a little bit with my seam ripper so that that doesn't scooch forward as I'm sewing. Then once I'm past that point, I'm going to do it again a little bit. And now we still have a little bit of a bump of extra fabric, but not nearly as much. So I'm going to keep sewing for a little bit, and then I'll do that correction again if I need to. Yeah, so I'm going to do that again. In a perfect world, we've cut everything perfectly square, the fabric hasn't stretched as we're folding or ironing or sewing, and we wouldn't have to do those corrections, but nothing is perfect, so that's how you fix it if it happens. come to the corner where I'm ending. So I'm gonna sew down to the end here, up this angle, across, and back stitch a bit. And because of the way I pivoted this, what I'm starting now is technically acting as the back stitch, although I'm stitching forward. There we go. We're going to trim these threads, and then we're going to take a look at the whole thing, see if there's anything that needs to be touched up on the stitching, but it should be pretty much done. Okay, it is done. Mostly. Should double check, but I have that top stitched down. I'm really happy with how that looks. My stitching is not perfectly straight, but it is good enough. I'm happy with it. So now what I want to do is just kind of take a brief look and see if there's anywhere where I didn't catch the edge of the hide when I was stitching these zigzags. And then if there is a spot where this is not an example of it happening, but just to show, if there's a spot where your zigzag is on the hide and then comes off the hide a little bit and then back, just go back and fill in that place where you missed it. There's a little spot here where I missed that hide with one stitch. I could go back and zigzag over that to catch that edge. I'm not going to worry about it. It's just one stitch. If it was 2 stitches that didn't catch it, then I might. But also this is going to be my blanket at my house. And so if that starts to pull out a little bit more, I can just go back and restitch it. If I was sending it to a customer, I might go back and fix that spot. Okay, I'm going to give it a gentle brushing. I don't want to brush too hard with the brush because it could catch my stitching, and I don't want to do that. So you can see the spots where I've patched in extra fur where it was really thin. It's not noticeable enough to bother me. I'm very happy with how that looks. And then the other thing that you can see is where the hair is really short here, you can see the fabric in between the rows, which may or may not bother you. It doesn't bother me. The alternative would be making the blanket shorter and not including these strips that have the really short hair right there. But I wanted to get as much width as I could on the blanket, so I'm okay with a little bit of the fabric showing there. And it's a nice neutral color. It's not like a bright red showing, although that could be cool too. This is the other side. So you can see where that was patched in. And this blends in a little bit better down here, but you can see that one and that one and that one a little bit. But overall, I'm very happy with how it turned out. You can see the stitching on the back side. There's a couple spots where when I changed from my straight stitch back stitch to my zigzag, I didn't have the settings right. So there's a couple places where my zigzag stitch is different than everywhere else. if you wanted to be really picky, you could go back and take that out and redo it. I'm not worried about that. There's a couple puckers in the fabric where I think that was where I had my needle down in the fabric, and then I went to adjust the hair and it shifted a little bit, and so the needle kind of dragged, and then I kept sewing, and so it makes a little pucker. I'm not really worried about those either. It is helpful when you stop your needle with your needle down to move the hair to the side. It helps if you have the needle through the hide too, and not just the fabric. So I tried to always end with my needle down in the hide before I pushed the hair out of the way and continued sewing. My spacing's pretty good. There's a couple places where you might notice like it's a little bit wide here and a little bit narrow here. Again, I'm not worried about that. I'm really happy with it. It looks really good to me. You can be as picky as you want to be, but don't be too hard on yourself. So because I used a fabric that has a nice drape to it, the blanket has a lot of drape and movement. If you used a stiffer fabric, it probably wouldn't have this much drape and flow to it. So that's something to keep in mind when you're making it. But try it out yourself, see how it goes, post pictures of it so I can see it, and don't be afraid to kind of take the parts and pieces from this video and this technique and make it your own, put your own spin on it. You could do horizontal stripes instead of vertical stripes. You could cut the pelt horizontally. And really, once you have the strips sewn onto the fabric like this, you can kind of treat sewing this like sewing a regular piece of fabric. You could cut pattern pieces out of this and sew it together into a vest or something like that. You could make a bunch of these and sew them together into a queen or king size blanket. That'd be really cool. Or even just a bigger throw blanket. If you did that, I would either sew them together along the sides and then do like a French seam or something like that, or you could even finish the edges and then zigzag the edges together. Lots of different options for that. So have fun with it, give it a try.